All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andre from Hong Kong. I'm also founder of Future City Summit, chairing and also moderating the panel today on Techno Utopias and also Deconstructing Smart Cities. So it's a very interesting, debatable topic today. And while everyone is enjoying the food, I would like to introduce our speaker today on the panel. So we have Jagan from DFID, and also we have Miya, and also Gordon, Karuna, and also Sheryl. So we come from very diverse background, and both public sector and also private sector. So a little bit house rule today is, given the time limit, so I would chair this panel for around 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A for 40 minutes. So I will try to make this topic as wide and also as interesting as possible. So I usually, like when we're preparing these conversation, we put that the collaboration between public sector and private sector on understanding smart cities, building a better smart cities for future is like dancing tango. So both parties are trying to dance on the same beat, on the same style, but at the same time we're trying to innovating for each other. So I'd like to start the conversation first by asking everyone here, since everyone is from very diverse geographical background and also the work that they're doing. So maybe start by Sheryl first, like how do you define or how do you understand smart cities in your context?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for ORF and for the distinguished panelists today for making this topic possible. I come from Vertech Capital. We are an investment and advisory firm headquartered in Singapore. Currently, we're investing about $8 billion in smart city projects across the Asia-Pacific region. We also look into projects in Europe for the next 2 years. In my experience in private sector investment into smart cities is not just about installing digital interfaces to traditional infrastructure. Smart cities need to be people-focused. It needs to look at how the interplay between city governance, citizenry, as well as the private sector come into play. So in terms of defining smart cities, there are three main types of smart city development because we're essentially operating in two different paradigms here. The first being developed cities like Stockholm, Singapore, New York, London. And then we have also got the vast majority of smart city development in emerging and developing economies, where the focus here is mostly focused on managing complex systems better. So how I define smart cities, the first tier is managing cities that, that can manage complex systems better. So for example, 10 years ago when IBM Technology started talking about smart cities, they were really trying to figure out how technology can solve the management and governance. So that's the first primary level. On the second level, it's really about providing new services that is not possible to provide without technology. So we're looking at ride-sharing companies like Uber or Airbnb, or making existing services better. The third level is making governance better. So that means making cities more responsive for citizens. A big part of this has to do with big data, data creation, to streamline the predictability of how to better govern a city and its different public service offerings. So that would be how I define smart cities. Thank you.
Hi. So smart cities have been defined in different ways by different people, but I think having worked in this space for some time, I have my own understanding of what a smart city should be or what it has to be when you want to plan and design it. First of all, I think a smart city should give the highest quality of life to a citizen. The citizen's potential should be maximized. So the smart city should be able to give that to citizens in that particular city. According to me, it has three dimensions. The first dimension is about economic vitality. Any smart city should be economically vibrant, which means the city should have a hybrid business ecosystem where you have big companies, small companies, minute micro companies, and startups. it's like a virus that feeds into the host, and the host supports the virus, and the entire ecosystem should be absolutely vibrant, and a smart city should be able to do that. The second dimension is about environmental protection. I think the ecological assets of a city have to be preserved and maintained. That's the second dimension. The third one is about equity. Several times we see that in most cities, the traditional city design has been leaving out certain sections of society, be it the poor, be it the senior citizens, be it the handicapped, or be it women. So these sections of society have to be somehow engaged in the city, and smart cities have to be inclusive. So these three aspects are very critical, and the center point of a smart city is a citizen. So raison d'être, as we say, the reason for existence of a city is a citizen. So the citizen will be right at the center. The infrastructure and services have to be built around his requirement so that the city will be economically vibrant, environmentally safe, and equity and inclusive, equity-oriented and inclusive. That is my understanding of a smart city.
Thank you, Karuna. And also, in the impression of the smart city, Gordon, based on your multiple experience in maybe now you're based in Germany and also your origin from South Africa, looking at the very deep tech and emerging technologies perspective, what do you see the definition of smart cities in your context?
So yes, as mentioned, I have the privilege and joy to, as a day job, to spend my time identifying early stage technology companies in the energy space and then making investments in those companies and then working with those founders to develop their business models. We do this in multiple jurisdictions. We talked about a little bit earlier on about how entrepreneurs will use jurisdiction arbitrage. Not every jurisdiction is friendly to all business models and business ideas. This is understandable. Governments are hesitant to take large risk at times because they want to keep their citizens safe and they want to keep their infrastructures safe. But we do see that there are multiple governments that are willing to be a little bit more flexible or provide more flexibility, or just as a haphazard scenario, their regulations just provide that flexibility by default. We find entrepreneurs then settling into those areas and then building technologies to solve problems that we find will be relevant to all of us in the future. And as those technologies get proof of concept and get traction and are proven to work in certain jurisdictions, as we mentioned, Singapore is one of those jurisdictions. The United Kingdom has a sandbox system. We've also found Bangladesh to be very flexible on these types of business models, etc. We believe India could be a very interesting jurisdiction to look at. Over time, as these companies build their technologies and these technologies are proven to be robust, we believe that other jurisdictions that are a little bit more rigid in their current regulations will actually start opening up and become more flexible to adopting these proven technologies. It's just about getting from 0 to 100 and the steps between that. I spend most of my time thinking about energy. When I think about smart cities, I think about how energy is going to change. What a lot of people don't realize is energy is going through the largest disruption since AC and DC was a topic at the turn of the last century. People aren't appreciating what kind of strain our infrastructure is going to be put under, considering the rise of changing consumer behaviors like the consumption of electric mobility. So talking about electric vehicles or electric scooters or electric tuk-tuks, or this puts a large strain on our infrastructure. And then we're also trying to add an enormous amount of renewables to our infrastructure. And in the good old days, matching supply with demand was quite easy. If people needed more energy, we just fired up more coal stations and we just fired up the nuclear reactors and we could provide energy. It was quite a simple process of matching supply with demand. But in a world where we have intermittent supply, so sometimes the wind blows and sometimes the sun shines and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it does it both at the same time, how do we match supply with demand all the time? And how do we provide that flexibility? And how do we balance our grid infrastructure? And at the moment, we don't have at all bidirectional grid infrastructure. So you're not able to put energy onto the grid and then take energy off the grid and then recirculate it. That's not possible. It's technically possible, but we just don't have that infrastructure in place. And we have all this legacy infrastructure we have to work with. So when you talk about smart cities, I think the development's going to be very different geographically all around the world. I think in some areas, but it will be very rare that you'll see a robust top-down approach that might work, but I don't have a high confidence in that approach. I think predominantly around the world it will be a grassroots from bottom-up approach. And you'll see sort of an ecosystem or tapestry of technologies being adopted, and will be driven by consumers. Consumers deciding, I want solar panels on my roof and a battery in my basement to purchase energy security for myself. I'm going to trade energy with my neighbors on a peer-to-peer basis, not to make money, but to have energy security. These are the types of things and the types of services that will drive behind that. People will say, I don't want to make these decisions on a day-to-day basis, how much I'm selling or buying my energy from my neighbors for. I want an algorithm to do that, so I'm going to set a protocol. And I believe protocols will be the fundamentals that will drive what a smart city is, that people can set protocols and then infrastructures within a city can execute on those protocols effectively and efficiently. That's generally my thinking.
Sure. Thank you, Gordon. So I will get back to you again about the top-down approach debate more later on. So I would like to pick a point about what Karuna said about the people factor in smart cities to Miya from South Africa context, working in Uhuru space, co-working new living style and also new entrepreneurship movement, especially for women, and also multiple innovations and creativity in South Africa, generating and uplifting new economies. So what is the core people factor that you would like to put inside the smart city concept in South African context? What is your take so far? What did you learn from the people in South Africa that you think very important in the context of smart city development in the future?
The people context. I'll take you back to when Cape Town, because I'm very based in Cape Town, where when it started defining itself as a smart city, what the city was looking for to become a smart city and what the people was thinking would be the smart city. So the city of Cape Town wanted to be very competitive globally. They wanted to attract proper investment. It was just before the World Cup, so the bid to host the World Cup was the biggest driver of what is the smart city. So it was very much focused on how do we attract tourists? How do we make sure that people who come outside Cape Town settle in the city and in South Africa? And that was very driven by the infrastructure because there was no proper infrastructure. And if you look at the impact of that now is that everything is with the middle class and the richer, and the poor are still in the same positions. And it was not because the people were not involved in the decisions. It's because the people were more focused on, I need skills, I need a computer, I need to be able to talk to my city, I need to be able to talk to the government. And if you can give me access to internet, which was the biggest challenge, which still is. So most people were more concerned about the basics, getting access, whilst the city on the other side was trying to serve the needs of the people from first world countries. So for me, with smart cities, I think what we need to be careful of is to find that balance. You mentioned the word equity, to make sure that even if we attract investors, they want to solve, Africa has too many problems, and many problems obviously create opportunities. Now you find that local people are not now solving their own problems because they are more concerned about the basic needs whilst people coming from outside are the ones who are really now being more creative. The ecosystem is now created for them. So for me, a smart city should be a city that's able to develop its own people and be able to bring the skills and the innovation and the creativity of their own people around themselves. And that's why we started Uhuru Space, to say, as software developers of Africa, with the African context, we need to start creating our own context and start negotiating on that basis as business people. Know that if I go on internet and find content, and like, let's say a picture, I go on Shutterstock and look for a black African woman, there isn't any. And it has nothing to do with the people. It's because the way the technology is built and the way our cities are being promoted and every content that's been promoted, it's forgetting that the people still need to build the skills first to be part of that inclusive tech.
Thank you, Miya. So I would like to add deeper context on the question to Jagan about, especially from the government, from the public sector perspective. So, say from DFID, UK government perspective, I think most of the contacts here we have been sharing so far are mostly, besides Singapore, is mostly from emerging countries, and there's another input on the conversation so far in development sector is always about awareness and capacity and also knowledge on smart cities or even development itself. So from the government perspective, how would you like to add on the, how is the government fostering the conversation? How is the government, say, development agency like DFID, fostering the understanding of smart cities for or bridging with the emerging economies?
Thanks for mentioning development in the question itself, because that's really what we are. We are a development agency of the UK government. The approach that we take is one, to be very discerning. One reason why we have to do that is that the idea of smart cities that has gained global traction has come from countries which are, as the Austrian government once described it, looking at beyond growth. These are countries that have, in a sense, grown to their, or cities that have grown to their, almost their limits, and are looking at better optimum utilization of resources, more efficiency in what they already have. Whereas we are working in countries which are developing. And therefore, the jargon, one might say, that we ascribe to is what we call ICT for development. And there is a lot of work that's happening within DFID, within a number of different development agencies, including multilateral banks, on ICT for development, which is somewhat different from the model that's followed by European cities or even American cities, and advanced economies like Singapore and Japan as well. So we need to be a little discerning about it. I think at its very generic and most fundamental, the way we would understand smart cities is that these are cities or the larger governmental ecosystems where governments and citizens indulge, and I use the word indulge on purpose, in evidence-based decision-making, right? So they're not driven by ideology, not driven necessarily by other extraneous conditions, but with the evidence before them, where government and society at large begins to be more evidence-driven, they're becoming smarter. And the way that obviously evidence today is presented is in the form of data. And data is at the very core of the model of smart cities that we are promoting, and at the core of ICT for development as well. The way in which DFID is working with the Indian government, with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, where we support the smart cities mission, is one, to promote the idea of innovation ecosystems. So we are actually helping the ministry to develop in all 100 smart cities innovation hubs that then link up with a sort of hub and spoke network across the entire country and the urban sector. As you know, India has 4,000 official cities and probably about 8,000 unofficially. The other very important aspect which we focus on, because unlike other countries where DFID invests overseas development assistance, in India we are running a sort of a pilot program where we use development capital to actually invest, take equity in companies, to invest in startups, and so on. Whereas in many other countries, we basically do humanitarian aid. So in India, we are very concerned about risk mitigation with regard to investments. And I think Sheryl also spoke about investments and actually creating the right ecosystem. And that's linked to the evidence base. If government and citizens are making more decisions on the basis of evidence, then it's likely to create a more or lower risk environment for investment. And investment is really what is most important today, because India doesn't, for instance, India just doesn't have enough of its own money. And even if the private sector pitched in at current rates of investment, we simply cannot meet the targets. So de-risking of investment in Indian cities is one of our focus points. So there are a large number of aspects that we look at, but I would say that fundamentally we want to push the paradigm of evidence-based decision-making as a smart way to urbanize.
Thank you, Jagan. So there are several factors that I heard from on the panel about when we're deconstructing smart cities, or basically how we are trying to understand the future of cities. What are we really talking about? So there are people factor, there are technology that works, there are model of development, top-down approach, for example, and also decision-making. So which is pretty much diverse and also completing the whole thinking model of when we're talking about what is the definition of city in future, besides talking about smart cities. So I would like to get back to Sheryl. Taking example of Singapore government, what is exactly your take based on your professional career so far in further capital? What do you see Singapore government or your firm, the relations, is actually trying to provide the value to smart city development? So Jagan also talks about, government is trying to take a more active role on decision making, on design. At the same time, like what is the example that Singapore government is trying to lead, and what is your firm is trying to also support as a whole?
Thank you. Obviously, I am not here to speak on behalf of my government. I come from the private sector, also Chatham House rules. I think primarily what Singapore does really well is that there are two variables that separate it from other cities, right? The first is that we're incredibly small. Our population density is about 7,000 per square meter, which is incredibly high. So one is that we're very small and easily governed, and of course we have a very strong rule of law. The second one is that the Singapore government doesn't employ a top-down approach when it comes to investment in the growth of our smart city. What we focus on is an ecosystem approach, like Dr. Shah rightfully pointed out. What that essentially means is that the government, 10 years ago, back in maybe 2009 to 2010, we released a digital master plan framework. And I think a lot of other cities that are smart now, including one of the world's leading smart cities, which is Stockholm, at that time also released all of their digital master plan frameworks. And this is very important for any city that's trying to be smart, because these frameworks are not meant to be laws or guidelines. They are meant to be visions of how the government postulates a future environment, right? And tech is just one component of that. We're also talking about finance. We're talking about private capital, public capital. We're talking about changing the contract between the citizen and the government. So I think what we did well was to be able to outline the government's vision in a participatory process with the citizenry. Then we did a lot of closed-door roundtables with the private sector and financial stakeholders. And then from there, we did a very cautious, wait-and-see approach when it comes to growing our innovation cluster here in Singapore. Right now, there are about 4 different centers of innovation on energy, on mobility, on telecommunications, key infrastructure sectors. So we take a very long time horizon when it comes to planning. So I think that answers your first question. What can we learn from the Singapore case, right? The second one I want to talk bit more about, which is directly my experience, is private sector funding and investment. So, which answers your second question, right? On what my firm is directly doing. So, just to really make the case for smart city investments, I mean, we're really looking at worldwide investments reaching about 96 billion US dollars globally in 2019. This has increased year on year by about 17.7%. So we're looking at a massive, massive growth opportunity for private institutions and investment funds to come in to close the kind of public-private capital gap that Dr. Shah rightfully pointed out. So APAC, the Asia-Pacific region itself represents over 40% of total global expenditure. So 40% of 96 billion. Our fund is only about 8 billion, so that's is a small dip in this huge growth opportunity we're seeing in the market. So I think what our firm is directly doing is looking at the two different paradigms I pointed out earlier, which is that of developed markets in Europe and in America, vis-a-vis developing markets like India and the greater South-Mekong region. So we have different investment strategies for both paradigms, aligning to how I defined a smart city earlier when I mentioned. I think what's very important for governments to do is to look not at, I mean, cities in general have limited capital to expand their smart city offering because they are very busy working on providing public service offerings and improving that. So what the cities need to do, I think, in my personal opinion, is to really deregulate and open up the market for private capital to work with the public institutions, whether it's PPP or issuance of bonds or de-risking of investment and various other frameworks. Dr. Shah talked a bit about blended finance. We are interested also in green finance, for example, many different bonds and instruments we can look at. So it's really key that cities do what they can and also analyze the responsibilities for your mayors at both the federal and the state level. Many times, mayors that are responsible for investment are looking after things like environment, which is very important in the city, but it's not directly relevant to the overall growth and leadership of the city. So I think looking internally at organization and seeing where the divide in leadership is can do wonders to drive investment. Yeah.
So thank you, Sheryl. So there are several key points I take from what you share. So first is a very long-term planning of Singapore government itself. And a little follow-up question to Sheryl is, do you think because of the relatively longer-term planning of Singapore government for the country, does Vertech Capital also try to align the investment strategy that Vertech Capital, your firm, and also your strategy is relatively longer? And how do you leverage the time, and how do you leverage the time over the risk when you're doing investment over technology or smart cities? Yes.
That's a very difficult question. I think primarily as a private sector representative, so essentially your question is about how do we align with this long-term horizon, right? So we do a piecemeal approach, right? We believe when cities are managing this smart city transition, we like to look at sectoral focus first. So we look into the energy sector, and then after that mobility, and then the telecommunications, and so on and so forth. By working directly with governments to transform specific sectors, that allows us to set parameters which are shorter in time horizons, which are more defined in terms of the value proposition, but also more importantly in the term sheets and things like that. So we do employ the account sectoral focus. And with regards to the second part of our question, which was on how do we manage the technological risk, I think this question, maybe Gordon can talk a bit more about assessment of technological risk. But in our perspective, we work closely with other investment funds, we work closely with other strategic advisory firms to really define the integration of new technologies to smart cities. So for example, one case, not all is rosy. So one case in point is Dyson, which was developing their electrical vehicle in Singapore, meant to launch in 2021, recently just canceled the entire project because they weren't able to make it commercially viable. So obviously the Singapore government has been working closely with Dyson to launch this electrical vehicle, but sometimes there are very real structural issues that make the adoption of technology too early or sometimes too late as well. So I think that, I hope that answers your question, yeah.
And absolutely follow up by Golden. So looking from a private perspective or private sector or investor perspective, so how are you looking at how you look among other movement of smart city technology, especially, again, echoing what Sheryl said, say mobility and also energy sector in smart cities. How do you particularly look at the technologies wise? Like, how do you pick the really champion technologies that can really impact the city? Like, while there are so many competitors in the market, how do you pick it up and incubate them?
So the way we approach it is we think of a hypothesis of what the future might look like. We look at the macro trends. If you think of decentralized energy resources, things like solar panels and batteries in basements and heat pumps and smart meters, etc. If you think of the investment in these spaces, at the moment, end users are investing about 140 billion globally in these types of assets, whilst the utility industry is investing around about 714 billion per annum into building up their infrastructure for providing energy. But in the next 10 years, by 2030, it's expected that private individuals will be investing about 1.2 trillion into these types of assets. Solar panels on roofs and batteries in basements. And chances are they'll want to get some sort of energy security by trading with their neighbors. And as mentioned before, like the major impact, like a major macro trend is the adoption of electric mobility. I mean, we're globally at around about 4 million vehicles. In the next 10 years, we'll be at 21 million vehicles. Volkswagen and Daimler and Nissan and all the multinational automakers have been late getting to the party, but they're all gearing up now to start rolling out production. So Tesla's been doing a really good job up until now, but I think the other automaker, I mean, Renault is already producing more electric vehicles every year than Tesla is, and I'm pretty sure BMW and Volkswagen and the rest of them are going to catch up pretty soon. When everyone goes home at 5 o'clock in the evening and they want to plug in their EV to charge it for the night for work the next day, that's going to lead to problems. So we're thinking about, what are the macro trends that are going to affect the energy system of the future, or it's going to affect cities in the future. And we're thinking about, sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people care about eating, drinking, security, things like that. And we're talking about things that are going to affect energy security. People get really nervous when they can't charge their cell phones. They get really nervous these days. It's really fundamental to human survival now. So, energy security is really, really important. So we're thinking about what kind of technologies are going to be required to continue to provide that energy security. And we're not just thinking about Europeans sitting in Germany. And as mentioned before this panel started, Germany doesn't have many greenfield opportunities when it comes to developing cities. We have a lot of really old infrastructure from a long time ago, and we've got to retrofit all that infrastructure to be smart. So mostly what we're looking at is sort of technologies that can retrofit legacy infrastructure or legacy buildings and legacy roads, etc. But we're also very excited by greenfield opportunities. I mean, there's large parts of the globe where there are people that have very little access to infrastructure, where there's pretty much no legacy infrastructure, informal settlements that are going to eventually build into cities. And they're going to basically jump an entire generation of legacy infrastructure. They're going to adopt new technologies most probably faster and more efficiently than the old legacy infrastructure cities. So we're quite interested in seeing what kind of technologies are emerging out of these areas, sort of the grassroots approach. So we look at that as well. When it comes to the government or the public sector, obviously they have to manage risk. They have to make sure that their citizens aren't exposed to unnecessary risk. This is where the private sector has to come in, and we have to shoulder that risk, obviously responsibly, and it's about risk management. We look at early stage technology companies, and the fact is we know when we invest in 20 companies, 17 of those companies are going to go bankrupt within the next 5 to 7 years. 17 out of 20, which means 3 of them have to make a big enough return to cover the cost of all those companies that went bankrupt, plus make an upside that justifies the risk profile of that investment. Now, if you do your due diligence and you select your startup founders correctly and the business models and product market fit and the rest, you should make good money following that approach, believe it or not. So it's about managing risk, and these are types of risks that usually the public sector just doesn't have the luxury to pursue. But the private sector is willing to do if the economics line up. So that's how we spend our time. We think about what is the future looking like, and then we think what kind of technologies or what kind of infrastructures are we going to need to enable that future, providing that continued energy security given macro trends that we see coming up, and then trying to think which technologies are going to fill those gaps. So in my case, I find DLT technology very interested. Distributed ledger technology or blockchain technology, very interesting. It's very early stage. It's very far out there, but we find it a very interesting sort of micropayments rails type technology, and there's multiple applications, but that will be very relevant in the future. Cybersecurity is incredibly important. As these infrastructures become more and more decentralized, and energy supply is a matter of national security. It is important that we have energy security not just for charging our smartphones, but to make sure we can also look after ourselves. There's going to be bad actors who are going to want to disrupt that system at times, and we have to make sure these systems are very robust against those bad actors. And then another topic is obviously smart buildings or smart infrastructure, IoT type stuff, buildings that can help balance the grid on a local level. Low voltage grid balancing is a huge problem at the moment. Keeping energy at that 50 hertz in Europe or keeping energy at 240 volts constant is becoming more and more of a problem given the load issues we're facing. Yeah, and then dealing with that legacy infrastructure, basically retrofitting it to make it work for this future we see coming.
Thank you. I just have a quick comment to add to what Gordon said. So if we look at the kind of investments in the type of technologies, the ones that have received the most funding in 2019 were fixed visual surveillance, of course, advanced fleet management for green mobility and public transit, smart outdoor lighting, and lastly, intelligent traffic management. So I think that gives you an idea as to what kind of technologies receive the most investments. I just wanted to quickly point out that even though we're talking at such a high level of this grand utopia we want to achieve with smart buildings and smart mobility, at the end of the day, in the context here in Asia, we're also very aware that the breakneck pace of urbanization and also trying to do too many things at once, right? Building a city and then trying to make it smart at the same time. We find that cities are still struggling to provide adequate housing infrastructure and is not well equipped to serve the needs of a surging population. So I think we have to bear that clearly in mind, that institutional resiliency is very important, and that's supported by stakeholders like the DFID. And the private sector has to do more as well to take that into account, the kind of informal economies, informal populations. Yeah.
Thanks, Sheryl. So before Jagan, definitely I'm pointing out one question after Gordon to DFID is, in your hypothesis on imagining the future of cities and technologies, how much do you involve governments in the whole hypothesis during your investment thesis. Do you think governments overall plays a super important role in part of the investment thinking so far, especially on the sector that you're looking at, energy grids? They're all related to government utility sectors. So how do you think governments should play a role together with investors? And that will be also next to Jagan and also later on Karuna as well.
So we do speak to the government. We do give ideas. Berlin's become quite an ecosystem in the blockchain space, and they have reached out to us, the German government, to find out how they can continue to be competitive in the space. A little bit the problem that Germany has is that their legislation isn't actually lending itself very well to blockchain technology startups. So what they do is they incorporate in places like the Caymans or the Virgin Islands or the UK or in Zug in Switzerland, but then they'll have their technology team in Berlin. So the actual team will sit in Berlin, they'll work in Berlin, but they'll pay their taxes somewhere else, and they'll lend the jurisdiction infrastructure of another location because it lends itself better to their business model. So the German government's obviously very interested in being competitive in this space, and they are speaking to us actively and figuring out how they can do that. But governments can't take huge risk, and innovation is risky business. And the more disruptive and the bigger and groundbreaking that innovation, the higher the risk profile of it as well. The more ambitious you are, the higher the chance it's not going to work out. But the really ambitious stuff is what really changes the world. So we need people to be chasing those enormous, ambitious goals. But it's risky. And governments can't just take on all these risky business models. So it's a bit of a problem. So the way we deal with that problem is, yes, we speak to the government, but we're not actually expecting them to change anything fast enough that it's relevant for us or our investment thesis or anything like that. I mean, there are major recommendations we can make that the government could maybe adopt that would make them significantly more attractive for foreign investment, significantly more attractive for individuals to start companies, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, governments are very slow-moving traditionally. So what we do is we look at jurisdictions that are more attractive or more friendly to these types of business models that we think are going to be relevant for the future. And then we try and build relationships. We try and find incubator programs. We try and find investors in those jurisdictions. We try and find influencers, policy, and build up a micro network, which we've done in multiple jurisdictions. We're very interested in looking at the subcontinent and India in particular for doing similar activities because we see lots of opportunities here. And then we make investments. And unfortunately, there are some jurisdictions where you get really, really smart people working on really interesting stuff. It's just the local environment is just very unattractive to make any investments. And that's really sad at times because you find really competent founders going after a problem, but you just see that the system is designed in a way that's not going to allow them to succeed, unfortunately.
Jagan, any disagreement from DFID?
Well, no, I can't say it's disagreement. I just wanted to actually address this whole issue about how governments look at their role. I think speaking for the UK government in particular, one is that it sees itself as a government that takes a global position on issues of global concern. And I don't think anything is of more urgency currently than the Sustainable Development Goals, which are about, the targets are over the next decade, which is not a lot of time at the pace at which the world moves. And the UK government has committed itself to contributing to the meeting of Sustainable Development Goals. And the first goal is the removal of poverty in all its forms. And I just wanted to stress that governments, not only the UK government but others as well, are concerned about addressing the really tough, audacious goals that we have set ourselves. And the removal of poverty is a very important such goal. And what the UK government is doing through DFID is to make available what we call patient capital. So go to places where private capital is obviously risk averse and therefore will not go there. or has a lower appetite for risk, and build the capacity in the private sector in those areas so that then you can begin to crowd in the private investment. So high risk, patient capital that begins to address the difficult questions related to making ICT available to the poor, for instance. And I think it's really important to note that we haven't as yet mentioned poverty in the panel, and I think we must keep that in mind. A lot of the investment that Sheryl spoke about is very unlikely to touch the poor. But India is a country that has 300 million people living in poverty. Now, you cannot speak about smart cities or the future of cities or the future of the economy or the world at all by still tolerating the idea that 1/3 of your population is living in poverty, you know? So I think this is precisely the kind of complex universe of questions and issues that the smart cities movement in its very disruptive way has brought about. Even in a country where you would not think smart cities are possible, in India, we are talking smart cities because we appreciate the disruption that it causes. It makes us sit up and take note of the challenges that in business as usual we would simply ignore or try and sort of tone down.
See, we have been talking a lot about Singapore and what's happening there, and also we heard a bit about what's happening in Germany, the impact investment that Jagan Shah talked about. But we must understand that India is a different ballgame altogether. I mean, we are a completely different country. Singapore is like perhaps one city that out of the 4,000 cities that we have, and so to actually understand how to develop smart cities in India, which is completely complex and layered, has to be really understood, because the way we look at smart cities, the way we define smart cities has perhaps to be understood today. I remember, when we embarked on these smart cities, it was like the world has already seen development of smart cities. Like we were already 1.5 decades into smart cities. So India had something called a late mover advantage. So we moved very late into the space of smart cities. Until then, we were like not even bothered about it. So when we moved into it, we had something like a late mover advantage. And what is that? 1.5 decades ago, I think when Barcelona and Rio de Janeiro were perhaps adopted by IBM and Cisco's, and then later you saw every other country, every other city getting smarter, looking at London data store, Singapore, your living labs, practically every city went into that, but India was remaining pretty silent. The advantage from that is all those technologies that have been tried were perhaps too expensive then. The technologies were perhaps not very mature then. Then it was vendor-driven. It was, at that point in time, vendors were driving smart cities. A vendor would go and talk to a mayor and say that this is what you need to have. But today, that is not the case. You see India's advantage today. We have learned from the world in the sense that the technologies are much, much cheaper now. They are more mature. There's no vendor competition as such. There is vendor cooperation and collaboration today. We have enormous amount of access to best practices and benchmarks, which, though other cities were like trying to learn, etc. So India started pretty much with an advantage. But we encountered several problems in terms of even defining what is a smart city. You would understand that when you really look at the entire landscape of smart cities, there were several, definitions. Like there were green, someone called it green cities, some countries called them circular cities, some call them digital cities, some call them just cities, justice-driven cities. So we were kind of, many scenarios were presented to us. So in India, we had to really understand what is it that we want. And then we started understanding that these definitions came from the economic models that those cities followed. For instance, if Nordic countries were going in for circular, cities, that's because of their circular economy that they, kind of endorsed. And if London looked at a digital city, that's because of their flat white economy that they always talked about. So everything came from their economic models, and they defined. And so India started understanding what is it that we need. And then when Jagan Shah talks about the poverty, India defined it very beautifully and said that we need inclusive cities. Our cities are absolutely inclusive, and that is how we kind of distilled and got into the definition of a smart city. And we also encountered several problems. Today, you might see it, I don't know, Singapore does it, of course. I mean, I have seen it in Copenhagen, I've seen it in other places as well. There is always this constant tussle between technology evangelists and people who are design-oriented. You know, the technology guys would say, let's go for driverless cars. Then these sustainability advocates and design people will say, drive less cars. They'll say, why do you want to drive so many cars? Just drive less cars. Then these technology people will always fight for, let's say, Internet of Things. And these people will say, interact with people. They'll say open data. They'll say open places. So there is always this constant tussle. So in India, we've kind of struck a balance between how much technology is required and what kind of design principles we have to follow. Then we started looking at the kind of technology absorption is also a very complex thing. Are we ready at all? I have seen it. It's not only in India because of the complexity we have. Our legacy systems, like Gordon repeatedly talked about, the load of legacy, as we call. Legacy is everywhere. I mean, it's not only in your IT systems, but it's also in the kind of understanding the bureaucrats have, policymakers have. Most of them had to be educated on what is a smart city, what could, technological intervention can do to your city. Then we had to build capacities, we had to look at investments, we had to identify our priority areas. As Maslow's hierarchy was repeatedly said, there could be a whole bunch of options, available to India, but we had to pick and choose the 3 things that made a world of difference to us. And that is how we approached in a complex country like India to actually understand, define a smart city, go for our priorities, understand investment patterns, look at public-private partnerships with risk sharing, because in certain services, you will never get private investments. Like for instance, in water, Jagan, how much, we saw repeatedly that no private entity would be interested in investing in privatizing water because the returns are very less. Now you have in transportation, there's a bit of investment into transportation, but again, we realize that most of them are non-performing assets today, including our metros, etc. So the impact investment that you talked about and you talked about are very relevant for India. In the Southeast Asia today, the impact investment in terms of putting in money for growing small entrepreneurs, making impact to the society is something that we are looking at and as a part of our entire smart city ecosystem today. So we are looking at incubation centers. They're practically everywhere in almost all 100 cities. We have those incubation centers. We are giving a lot of thrust to startups. We have several partnerships all over the world today. So somehow we kind of got a grip on how to navigate this whole smart city business.
So just quickly, I think we have only about 10 to 15 minutes left, but in my last intervention, I mentioned that, what Gordon and I were talking about is this utopia of a digital city. And we understand that there are 2 different paradigms for developed and developing contexts, right? I mentioned that adequate housing, infrastructure, and serving the needs of a surging population still remains to be unseen as cities in the developing world continue to try to first develop the city and then also try to make it smart. So in my colleagues here on the panel, Dr. Shah, Baratang, and Karuna, how do you guys see that balance of the tension? When you work with governments, when you work with aid agencies and private capital as well as private sector people, do you think the narrative is about that, like balancing this? Stop giving me all these technologies, I need to first feed my people. Or is it something else?
Yeah, this question of balancing is really, really important, especially when we started setting our priorities. We understand that the basic requirements are in, let's say, giving water supply, keeping our cities clean, building low-cost infrastructure, building low-cost homes. All these are very necessary for us at this point in time. But when we approached the private sector, the private sector was not really keen on investing in any of these because the return on investment is quite negligible in those areas. So, then we started looking at this thing called viability gap funding, kind of ensure you put in a bit of money, enthuse the private investor to, get in his bucks so that the momentum of development and growth continues, and we track the development and show report cards to say that things are actually, improving, and it has impacted the lives of a few people, negotiating with the private sector. But still, I find that it is very difficult. And what we realize is this, not the big players, but the small, I like the Gordon's idea of an individual investing and, making his own home smart and his own, life sustainable. So we have pretty much understood now these informal investors and groups of small, in India we have a whole bunch, entire informal economy working parallelly, making its own, garnering its own support, getting their funds together. So that's where we see things moving, not the big ticket investments coming from, big players wanting to see big returns on investment. I don't think that's going to happen in India.
Just to add on what she said, because I think I agree with everything that you said, is that the balance should come from this informal investment. And because investors, like Gordon said, they're more interested in what's going to happen in the next 50 years. They're not going to worry about these basic problems. Now, in South Africa, what they did is they introduced a platform called GovChat. The community, the civil people can talk on GovChat, raise all their issues that are challenging them. It's just changed the way people used to raise issues towards government, which is like uprising and all that. So it's now already changed the mindset of the people. And you must understand, we jumped generations. We didn't go into having a computer in the house. We just moved straight to having the smartphone and being able to produce the best fintech in Africa. So based on that, I know that even now we're going to jump generations of smart cities, because our informal settlements, they're just empty. There isn't anything built. You don't have to remove anything to build something new. You just have to build from scratch, and you can look at the future, what's going to happen in the future. What the balance should be, the skills. For me, it's about the skills. If you don't bring our people to adopt technology better and create technology that will solve their own issues, then that we're missing the point.
Shall I very quickly respond to Sheryl's question? I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's like we have to wait for something before we do something else. It's not linear in that sense. But clearly, the application of ICT for development is showing that actually populations of the poor, slum dwellers and such like, are precisely the ones that are likely to take up the applications of these technologies, actually. So there is great appetite because they clearly see the value proposition. So I think the market it's very variegated, and clearly there's a lot of scope for us to look at an inclusive, democratic kind of approach to the way that smart cities develop.
If I could also add something regarding the smart city topic, and it's not just IT smarts, but also human capital smarts, which is quite important. I think traditionally, when people have thought of globalization or human mobility, it's been talked about nation states, people moving to the United Kingdom, which has one of the best, the government in the United Kingdom has done a fantastic job at making it attractive to invest in early stage technology companies in the UK. They have wonderful sandbox programs, the ICE program, et cetera, et cetera. They're truly a model to look at if you think of how to make your ecosystem attractive, to attract foreign capital as well as foreign entrepreneurs, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the point that I'm trying to get at, is it's not the UK per se, it's London. And when people think, go to the UK to start a company, they're not thinking going to the UK. They're not going to Birmingham or anything. They're going to London. And when they think of going to Germany to start a company, most of the time it's I'm going to Berlin to start a company, or I'm going to San Francisco to start a company. And this is the difference. As the people that have the most mobility internationally tend to be the smartest people in our societies. They tend to be the people with the skills and the abilities. They're also the people that have the ability to build companies and attract capital and do these things. They have choice today. They can go anywhere in the world. A smart Indian who has ambition can go anywhere, as well as a smart South African or a smart Venezuelan, or they can go anywhere. It's not easy, but if they got the skills and the smarts, they can go anywhere. So they've got mobility. And what's going to happen in the future is cities are going to be competing for these people to say, this is where I'm located, or at least this is where my post box is, where I officially say I'm located. And that's what lots of governments don't realize, is that the smartest parts of their civilization or their countries can choose where they go and can choose where they pay their taxes. And if they're not careful and if they don't create smart cities that have the institutions in place, who have the security and the safety and provide to that Maslow hierarchy of needs that I mentioned earlier on, they're going to have major problems keeping those peoples. And then it's going to be very difficult to change what's happening there, because you actually need the intellectual capital to be attracted to a city. And this is what smart cities is about, is creating the infrastructure. And as mentioned, I mean, it's not just IT, it's also governmental infrastructure that will attract these individuals.
We talked about human capital. I remember in the year 1991, everybody talked about which country do you come from, and they talk about productivity and development. They use three M's, right? Men, money, and material. So I said those back then that I come from a country that has three M's, but it is men, and men. So it's a human capital rich country, so obviously it's all about building human capital and, this.
Thank you, everyone. So before we quickly wrap up the panel, so let's take a few questions in the audience today. If there's any questions, the time is running out, but I think if there's any questions in the audience, feel free to raise hand, and we are just. There's a mic behind yet.
So my question is to Karuna ma'am. So recently Japan had a very strongest typhoon in the decade, and the government handled it very well. So are the Indian smart cities going to acquire some techniques from the Japanese government to handle such type of calamities?
So disaster management.
Yeah.
I mean, not only Japan, I think we have to learn even from the bad experience of New Orleans, right? So I think the first investments into our cities have been about setting up control and command and control centers that give us a grip on, how the critical infrastructure is working. So we are learning, and our disaster management cells are kind of shaping up. So we are preparing. In fact, if you've seen what happened in Andhra Pradesh, when there's a huge cyclone called Hudud that came 2 years ago, there's absolutely no casualty. The way we detected it, the way we moved thousands of people out of their tenements and, created those structures and had a complete control on how that could be managed. So some cities are ahead in now predicting disasters and preventing and maintaining, but we are still learning. Some cities, we're still learning.
Any other questions? Yes, lady. Yeah, the lady behind first. Sorry.
So my question is to
You're the next.
I've not been able to understand in the Indian context what we find it there. The cities basically are the old cities, downtown cities, and then how I say going to take away the modern or the so-called the smart cities as such. And you can't even take a bicycle there.
Exactly.
I mean, on the side of it, IT should be there, space should be there, everything should be there. But I know I had some ideas like, why don't you develop the
Satellite.
And decongest here.
Yeah.
Decongest those people. Rather than, I mean, everything around that particular city.
Yes. So in fact, the reason I grabbed the mic and started talking about Indian scenario is this. I mean, India, we have extremely complex scenario. And building a green city, you know, outside is easiest. Your proposal is perhaps the easiest one. You know, just go outside the city, you know, make a mint fresh city, you know, right from the word go. That's perhaps the easiest thing to do, but they're very, very expensive. So, you know, it is really difficult to build a green city ground up. So our investments, we are not a rich country, as you know, Jagan and they've been repeatedly saying how difficult it is to attract investments. So brownfield in India, that's the reason why we said our smart cities are cities that will be developed. The existing cities, the brownfield cities, will be made little smarter in the sense there will be predictability in terms of how a person leads a life. Like there will be predictability on when he gets his water, whether he's going to get water at all, or transportation, whether he's going to have connectivity, etc. How availability of housing, creating jobs, and so our definition has been very different from the world's definition of technology infusion of funding. So we had to survive with something like that because of our existing scenario. So it's easy to build. So satellite towns are being planned, isn't it?
It's easy to do the brick and mortar work, and maybe even to transport populations there, but economies can't be engineered like that.
Yeah,
So, you know, economy is very much rooted to human populations and where they work together. In a certain kind of density which is urban. So, you know, we can do all of that as long as there's economic growth in those remote locations.
Thank you. So to wrap up the panel, I would like to lastly put one factor, which is time. So I would like every panelist, audience are a mix of different generations, students I saw, and also definitely seniors, also experienced professionals. So to wrap up the panel, like everyone, please have one maybe last sentence to address in the context of 50 years in future, what is the message you want to pass on to the next generation for future cities? Maybe Jagan first, yeah, any idea?
Oh, well, this is a project that I used to run recently. It's child-friendly cities. The message should be that children, the youth, have to take command of their destiny because the elders aren't doing a great job of doing it.
Miya.
For me, it will be a future where women, there's no patriarchy. Women are respected, and we're busy building the future for the young girls. And we want a world that will be able to allow them to lead and be part of the new technology equally, equitably as everybody in the society.
That's a big one. I guess for me, I would like smart cities in the future to account for more of the externalities that our current economic systems don't account for. So things like pollution, carbon, etc. Those things should be priced a little bit better than they are today. At the moment, we charge nothing for polluting our air and polluting our water, and if no one owns it or no one is responsible for it, then it will be abused. It's just the curse of the commons, unfortunately. So I hope that smart cities of the future will account for the externalities that our current system doesn't account for more efficiently, to provide a healthier and more prosperous future for our children than what it looks like we're going to be leaving them. And as mentioned, inclusion of everyone, everyone having the ability to pursue happiness with dignity and have access to opportunities in education, health, and safety. These should be the fundamentals. Cities are there for the population. They are meant to be serving the population, and that's what essentially a smart cities should be doing.
What I envisage is today we see that citizens are not completely engaged in running our cities. Either citizens are engaged just a little bit, or they're engaged completely that it becomes a burden on them. Like you make strategies for a city, you deliver, you clean up your community, you do so much. But I think what I envisage is just a moderate amount of involvement with government and a sensible partnership and a collaborative platform that every citizen starts owning his city and becomes an ambassador of his own city and gets humiliated if someone says something about his city and takes pride when someone praises. So that bit of engagement, that bit of ownership is something that I think eventually each of the citizens will perhaps become ambassadors of their own city. They might even become walking billboards of their own city when they travel around the world. This is what I see.
Just very quickly, it's just sustainability and climate change. I hope Singapore and all the other low-lying countries like the Maldives survive.
Thank you. So let's join the panel together. Give a round of applause to all the panelists for the contributions.